Hi, welcome to Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. One of the most common questions I get asked in the comments on this channel is why don't you use Islamic sources, or why don't you consider hadiths to be reliable? The second one is a bit of a loaded question, but today I'll try to answer these questions as best I can. In the process, I also want to talk a bit about the historical method and exactly how that applies, especially for early Islamic history. Let's limit this discussion to the history of early Islam, that is from 610 CE, when the Prophet Muhammad began his mission as the Messenger of God, to 750 CE, when the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed the Umayyad Caliphate and established its hegemony over the Islamic world. This period of around 1.5 centuries is when Islam crystallized, when the Quran was compiled, when the meaning of what it means to be a Muslim was clarified. In the Abbasid era, after 750, much of Islam started to take the shape that we recognize today. But before 750, things were still very much up in the air. It was during the Abbasid period that much of the history of the early Islam was compiled. Before this, we know that there were some disparate sources here and there on rocks and leaves and letters, but no actually compiled books that have survived. Now, to say that I don't use Islamic sources is simply incorrect. First, what does one mean by Islamic sources? Does that mean sources written by modern Muslim historians? If you mean modern books, then certainly I have used books by many contemporary Muslim historians for various videos. I regularly read books by people who, at least from their names, seem to be Muslim. It would be generally very difficult to somehow write a history of Islam without reading contemporary Muslim scholars, because a lot of those historians are Muslim, or at least from the Islamic world. Like, for example, if you wanted to study the history of India, you'll find that a lot of those books were written by historians who actually are from India or have ties to it. That's because for a lot of people, their interest in history begins by asking the question, who am I? And so their focus ends up being on something that's part of their identity. What interested me in history, for example, was asking why people from India who look like us and speak like us are so different in their religious practices. So I do certainly use a ton of books by Muslim scholars for my videos. I even like to highlight some opinions from these scholars in my videos. For example, in my video about what medieval Muslims thought about ancient Egypt, I specifically read Muslim and Egyptian Egyptologists and tried to understand what they think of their history. Now, if by Islamic sources you mean medieval sources by Muslim authors, then, well, I have directly quoted Islamic scholars like Muhammad ibn Ishaq and Muhammad al-Tabari on this channel very many times as well. Again, you cannot craft a narrative of Islamic history without the help of Muslim scholars from the time period. Take, for example, the Arab conquests and the rise of Islam. The non-Muslim authors who wrote about it in the 7th and 8th centuries were understandably quite salty about it. They had just lost to the Arab Muslims, and so they used a lot of what can only be described as exaggeration and religiously charged language. If you go in the opposite direction, the Muslim sources are also biased in the favor of Muslims themselves, and you wouldn't expect them to always include the nasty details of the conquest. Conquests are, by their very definition, very bloody, and realistically, always include some, atrocities. Not only that, but there were actual companions of the Prophet involved in the conquests, and those are revered figures. So a Muslim author would be a bit hesitant before writing something bad about them. So you can't completely rely on either, and you have to sift through both to isolate the reasonable and realistic parts and try to build a narrative from that. I have never come across a historian who only used non-Islamic sources to write anything about Islam. The only book that does that is Patricia Crona and Michael Cook's Hagerism, and that's less of a book and more of an experiment, frankly. The book's main point was that non-Islamic sources from the period can give us a clearer picture of what happened than Islamic sources. However, the book itself makes the same mistakes that it accused Islamic traditionalists of. It took non-Islamic sources very uncritically. Still, it inspired a new movement within the field of early Islamic studies and brought non-Islamic sources into the fray. So now we can get a broader idea of what happened, but we have to be careful when analyzing the sources. I think the most likely meaning of Islamic sources in the comments might be hadiths and other traditional writings by religious scholars. That is more of an accurate thing because I don't use hadiths as sources for my videos. Generally, the term hadith means the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's also extended unofficially to mean a larger canon of books that includes other things. For example, the book Sahih al-Bukhari, which is the most revered collection of hadiths, also includes events that happened after the Prophet's death. They're technically not hadiths, but they're usually lumped together. If there is another word for them, it's escaping me. I can't really think of one. Just keep in mind that I mean both the actual hadiths and stories from after the Prophet when I say hadith. The problem with these books is that they're not historical texts. They're religious texts. Imam al-Bukhari wasn't trying to record the history of the Arabs, but rather he was trying to establish a canon of religious teachings of Prophet Muhammad to know what a Muslim was supposed to be like, rather than what a Muslim was or had been like. It was more concerned with the present than the past. He used a criteria to decide which hadiths to include as accurate and which to reject as incorrect, mistaken, or outright forgeries. Now, if nothing else, we have the Shia-Sunni-sized elephant in the room. Sahih al-Bukhari is considered by Sunnis to be the second most sacred book in Islam, behind only the Quran, but the Shias don't believe that. The Shias don't take any hadiths that come from people who opposed Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali is revered by the Shias as the first Imam, and anyone who opposed him, for any reason, is considered by them to be people who go against the teachings of the Prophet and hence cannot be trusted. This brings us to the topic of revered personalities. As a religious person, certain people are elevated above everyone else and are rather untouchable, exactly for religious reasons. For example, let's say that you can absolutely accurately trace a hadith back to someone like Abu Bakr or Umar ibn al-Khattab. Sunni Muslims would simply believe whatever they say because they were companions of the Prophet and pious Muslims, so we wouldn't expect them to misrepresent the words of the Prophet Muhammad. However, a Shia wouldn't believe them precisely because they're Abu Bakr and Umar ibn al-Khattab, whom they accuse of many things, including hurting the family of Ali and usurping his rightful office of the Caliph. For secular historians, either of these reasons wouldn't matter. They're not looking at it from a religious perspective, so they're not biased in favor of or against Abu Bakr and Umar and would judge the hadiths on other merits. Let me give you another example. Let's say that there's a narrator. Everyone in the community respects him as a pious Muslim. He prays regularly and is generally considered a good person. We can establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he got the hadith from his teacher, who got it from his teacher, and so on and so forth. However, our narrator is on the payroll of the Umayyad Caliph at the time. The compilers of the hadiths would give him points for being pious and write him off as a bold man who's on the caliph's payroll but is unbiased. However, modern secular historians don't hold that standard. Modern secular historians would give him no points for being pious and subtract quite a few points for being on the caliph's payroll. They would be suspicious of anything the narrator says that relates to authority. Hadiths have a large corpus of material about these narrators, including the biographies and genealogies of many of them. However, a lot of that too is based on hearsay and unreliable older traditions. What method did the compiler of the hadiths use to separate the truth from the embellishments? Compilers did actually use people's genealogy as a factor in determining how truthful they were. Let me give you two more examples because this is one of my favorite topics. So Al-Tabari records a source from Imam Jafar al-Sadiq that says that when Hussein ibn Ali's body was discovered after the Battle of Karbala, there were 33 stab wounds and 34 blows on his body. If we can reliably trace this to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, the Shias would certainly consider this to be true, but is it really? Is it realistic or reasonable? Is it imaginable that someone sat down and counted the wounds on Hussein's body? It's not like anyone did autopsy on him, so can we really say that Hussein's body was lying there after his brutal death and someone, rather than immediately burying him with all the respect and veneration he deserved, was counting his wounds? A secular historian would see this as poetic exaggeration meant to get a point across rather than record history. Another example comes from the Sikh faith. In 1705 CE, the Mughal Empire of India sent an army to defeat the Sikhs under the command of Guru Gobind Singh. This resulted in the Battle of Jamkor, where the Mughals defeated the Sikhs. Guru Gobind Singh was present there, and he wrote a letter in the form of a poem to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, declaring his moral victory. In the letter, the Guru says that the Mughal army was 1 million strong. Given that Guru Gobind Singh was present there, should we take his word that the Mughal army was indeed 1 million strong? Well, if you're a Sikh, then the answer is quite simply yes, but it's not that simple for secular historians. The source by Guru Gobind Singh is a poem, not a historical text, and poems have metaphors and analogies and exaggerations. When we look at historical evidence for the whole thing, we come down to a much smaller number. The Mughal army during Akbar's reign was around 4 million, and by 1705, when Jamkor happened, Mughal administration had greatly deteriorated. Plus, Aurangzeb was in the south of India at the time fighting the Marathas. That was his focus. There's no way that Aurangzeb would send a fourth or frankly even an eighth of his army to fight a group of nobodies up north. Even 50,000 Mughal soldiers at Jamkor would be generous. This too is a poetic point to highlight how big the difference between the strength of the Mughals and the Sikhs was. The Sahih in Sahih al-Bukhari means authentic. That's because all the hadiths in it are authentic according to the criteria of Hadith collection. If we have a book that we just consider authentic, then doesn't that sort of kill the entire field of early Islamic historical study? All the truth you need is in that book. But then again, many religious scholars have questioned the authenticity of some of the hadiths in the book. One of the interesting ones that I came across recently is that Muslim feminists have been criticizing the companion Abu Huraira, who has a remarkably huge number of hadiths told on his authority, despite the fact that he only spent 4 or 5 years with Prophet Muhammad. Many of his hadiths are, let's say, not that favorable to women, and so certain Muslim feminists want him to be completely dismissed out of hand, and they're not the only ones to raise this point. Plenty of male religious scholars have as well. So the point is that even all Sunnis don't agree on this book being fully sound and authentic. There are hadiths in it that contradict other hadiths in the book. There's also hadiths that contradict historical evidence that we have from other sources which are of better quality. To filter out these hadiths is the job of religious scholars, not secular historians. At the end of the day, if you take hadiths blindly into account, you have to leave out a lot of other stuff. Not only historical sources, but also the perspective of other Muslim groups, such as the Shias, who have been, of course, very influential in the history of Islam. We already leave out the perspectives of many religious groups within Islam, like the Kharijites, so should we add Shias to that list too? Doesn't Islamic history then become just the history of Islam according to the Sunnis? After all that compromise, we get a book that was written 150 years after the Prophet and is constantly being questioned from all sides of the aisle. That's why hadiths have to be left aside as religious documents rather than historical ones. But that doesn't mean that nothing related to hadiths can be used. The man considered as the founder of the field of the Prophet's biography was one Urwa ibn Zubair. Urwa repeated a lot of hadiths based on the authority of his aunt Aisha bint Abu Bakr, who was a wife of the Prophet. Those hadiths are certainly used by secular scholars to understand the Prophet's life. So hadiths are certainly used, but they're used individually on their own merits rather than by the criteria established by religious scholars. The chain of narrators, for example, is never taken at face value and is always treated with a great degree of skepticism. There have also been hadiths that are sahih or authentic but haven't stood up to tools like textual criticism. And what about hadiths that are prophetic? These are hadiths where the Prophet is predicting the future, and of course, those predictions have come true. Does that mean that a secular historian must understand that God indeed told these things to the Prophet, and hence the whole secular part of the secular historian must be thrown out of the window? The point is that a Muslim simply looks at hadiths with a different perspective than a secular historian does. So, which is true? Well, that's a bit complicated. Over the past 2 centuries or so, historians have been on the mission of finding the key to, quote, objective history. That is, history based on objective facts that everyone holds to be true. This goal was inspired by the different sciences around historians that used facts to establish hypotheses and could test those disprovable hypotheses in a lab. Historians wanted to find something like that. In the process, a rigorous debate sprung up among historians. Is the study of history considered a part of the sciences or the arts? Like most things historians discuss, the question doesn't have a simple answer. Many historians believed that it was somewhere in between. After the Second World War, many historians picked up this debate again. They had seen how historical narratives were tainted by ideology and wanted to find something that could, well, be objective without ideology. The hard, simple, clear, and indisputable truth. They agreed that history was somewhere in between the sciences and the arts, but they had to take it further towards turning it into a science. As Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie said in 1979, tomorrow's historian will have to be able to program a computer in order to survive. For this particular group of historians, there was an objective truth somewhere underneath the noise of facts, and it could only be found through science. They proposed adopting the scientific method to fit the needs of the fields of historical studies, using equations, models, and statistics to determine the truth. One of the first major books written with the extensive use of this method was Fogel and Angerman's Time on the Cross, written in 1974. In this book, full of charts, tables, and statistics, they analyzed historical records to determine that slavery was indeed profitable and that slaves at the time enjoyed the same living standards as free workers did. Obviously, they were criticized for not being politically correct, but that's not all that they were criticized for. Scholars were quick to point out that the data they had picked out to analyze was biased and taken out of context. Their very human and very subjective biases had stood in the way of their quest to draw the objective truth from sources. That brings us to why history can never really be completely scientific. If I simplify the scientific method, I'll say that it's making an observation, making educated guesses, which scientists call hypotheses, as to why that happens, testing the guesses to check if they hold up, repeating the tests to see if you get the same result again. This method has a high degree of objectivity. If the original hypothesis is accurate, then everyone should get the same results under the same conditions. However, the historical method is a lot different from this. If you simplify it, it's not about making observations, because you can't observe an event that's already in the past. You have to observe its remains, archaeological or textual, etc. Then you have to make guesses as to what the remains mean. However, you don't really have many methods to test the accuracy of your guess or hypothesis. Some hypotheses can be tested through various means, but not all of them can be. So not everyone who read the same source would make the same hypothesis. They might not even understand the source in the same way. I recently looked into an artifact called Sinai 361, which was supposed to be the textual evidence for Moses' existence, but various scholars believed that instead of Moses, it's talking about someone called Mad. It's ridiculous how subjective all this is. So we usually go by what most scholars in the field think is more probable. For example, you know the whole Mecca was actually Petra debate that's so popular on the internet? Well, no serious academic historian has ever supported the idea that Petra was the original birthplace of Islam, despite the fact that there's a video on YouTube that has convinced a lot of people by portraying itself as a documentary. When academic historians start taking an interest in that idea, then it would be worthy of discussion, but so far they haven't. Stephen Shoemaker puts the whole thing really well in his book, Creating the Quran. I've used the quote in other videos, but it's just so good. He says, "Prove is of course a very loaded term. Historians are rarely able to prove absolutely that something did or did not happen, particularly for matters of great antiquity or when dealing with the formative history of a particular community, which is often a very active site of shifting memories. Instead, historians seek to identify reconstructions of the past that seem to be more or less probable using various critical methods of analysis and logical reasoning. Proof of something almost always escapes us. So the truth, in italics, if such a thing even exists, isn't found in the field of historical studies. You can use different methods to come to very, very different results. So to say that Sahih al-Bukhari isn't true is not a statement that would be considered historical. Rather, it doesn't stand up when subjected to the criteria of Western historical method. That criteria might be different than how some other group of people, for example, Muslims, judge a hadith. Now let's talk about the Western historical method. First of all, I really dislike that term. People usually use this term to say that it's just one of various historical methods, which might be true, but still, this historical method, often called the historical method, is no more Western than, say, chemistry is. While in the past few centuries, the leading chemists have been from Europe or America, and much of the progress in the field of chemistry has been made by them, it doesn't mean that it's Western, because much of the foundation of chemistry was laid down in other places like China, India, Greece, Africa, and the Middle East. Similarly, the historical method should not be understood as some kind of Western idea. One of the earliest pioneers of this method was Ibn Khaldun, the man behind the OG al-Muqaddimah. In his book, he challenged many established ideas in history by subjecting them to criticism and data from other fields of study. For example, he used sociology, statistics, and population data from Egypt to rectify the number of Israelites who must have left Egypt with Moses at the time of the Exodus. He used the same method in other places. This is a technique that we still use. So secular scholarship shouldn't be dismissed as some kind of Orientalist propaganda, but rather understood as an attempt to understand what likely happened by a different set of people using a different set of tools. There are plenty of Muslim and Islamic voices in this field of study as well, and it's not simply steered by Europeans or Americans. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but people in the Islamic world do think that Westerners don't always portray an honest image of them, whether due to a lack of understanding or malicious intent. That is not entirely unfounded, after all. Look at Bernard Lewis or, well, the modern liberal media and its discussion of Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. The deliberate and blatant dishonesty in Israel's favor by the media recently hasn't gone unnoticed. But that problem isn't as common in academia because academia is generally quite a left-leaning environment, and we've seen how students have been protesting against Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. Also, like I said, there are plenty of Eastern voices in academia that are always there to check whenever something like that happens. However, their voices aren't always very clear, as mainstream media tends to pick up stories that are more bombshelly than their rebuttals. Like that time the media made a big deal out of the fact that the Birmingham manuscript was radiocarbon dated to between 568 CE and 645 CE, implying a chance that the Quran actually predates Prophet Muhammad. However, not many people really read all the rebuttals to that by academic scholars who wrote about why that isn't possible and talked about the problems with the radiocarbon dating itself and what other evidence said about the manuscript. I can bet that not many people looked up any papers by academic scholars to check what they said about it. Also, academic papers are too often locked behind paywalls, so I can also understand why people don't read them. The whole system is messed up, to be honest. It's just messed up. Knowledge is human property and a human right, and it should be available for free to everyone. We need a revolution of the proletariat right now. So the point is that on this channel, I prefer to use the historical method and read books by secular historians. There's plenty of places on YouTube that make videos from a religious perspective and present the view of Islamic history as traditionalists have recorded it. I'm just not one of them. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to impress Westerners, and as people often say in my comments, or weirdly that I'm Shia. What does Shiism even have to do with secular history? Also, have you seen my videos? How does my video on Caliph Muawiyah the Great make me look Shia? It doesn't mean that I'm being paid by the CIA or the Jews. I wish I was being paid by the CIA. I live in Vancouver. It's really expensive here. I could use some extra money, but the CIA just isn't interested in me, I guess. The only favor I get through this channel is when a video game publisher sends me a free code for one of their games. Anyhow, I hope I made things clear for everyone who watches this channel. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.